managerial accounting, planning and control, fixed manufacturing overhead variances. Now, the final variance that we're going to calculate is the fixed manufacturing overhead volume variance. And the formula for the volume variance, we compare the total budgeted fixed manufacturing overhead with applied fixed manufacturing overhead. So this is the only variance that cannot be derived from or is not a part of the flexible budget performance report spending variance. This one stands alone. Total budgeted in $130,000. Now, what about the applied fixed overhead? Now, recall from the chapter on job order costing and manufacturing overhead that the amount of overhead that is charged to the product is based on that predetermined overhead rate times whether it's units or direct labor hours, but times some activity base. So that's what we need to calculate here. Well, before we can calculate the amount of applied overhead, we need to figure out what that fixed manufacturing overhead rate is, because it wasn't given to us in our initial data. So let's go back to excuse me, to our data for the standards. And recall our fixed overhead we just saw was budgeted at $130,000 per month. Now also recall that planned production was 20,000 units. So if we're applying overhead per unit, then 130,000 divided by 20,000 units is going to give us a fixed overhead rate of $6.50 per unit. Now, the information that we started with says that variable overhead is applied based on direct labor hours. So really the predetermined overhead rate would be 130,000 divided by planned direct labor hours. Now, just for the sake of it, let's see what that rate would look like. And we'll kind of squeeze it down here at the bottom. Again, our fixed overhead was budgeted at a total of $130,000, and the number of labor hours, our standard labor rate was 0.75 hours per unit. So if we planned to produce 20,000 units, then what was our planned level of labor hours? 20,000 units times 0.75, or 15,000 15,000 direct labor hours. Well, that's going to translate into a rate of 8.66666 per direct labor hour. So this one would yield some rounding issues, but if that's how overhead is applied, then we just deal with the rounding issues. Now, for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to use this $6.50 per unit because the effect is going to be the same. Again, some minor rounding issues, but the net impact or the variance will be pretty close to identical, whether we use 8.666 per direct labor hour or $6.50 per unit. So let's use the $6.50, keep our math as simple as possible. Now we can come back to our formula for our fixed overhead volume variance and finish the calculations. Applied overhead is our predetermined rate of $6.50 times the actual activity, which, since we're using the units rate, we'll use the actual units, 23,000. Okay, and then we'd multiply that times, or excuse me, after we do the multiplication, that's going to yield 130,000 minus 149,500. So our fixed overhead volume variance, $19,500. And that's a favorable variance. Why is it favorable? Well, remember what type of cost we're dealing with. Fixed manufacturing overhead. So if fixed manufacturing overhead applied was greater than that which was budgeted, it is because we produced more units than we had planned to produce. So this is actually nothing more than over-applied fixed manufacturing overhead. And because we produced more units than we had planned, then our economy of scale kicked in. And that's why, again, why it's a favorable variance. Our actual fixed overhead per unit was lower as a result of producing more units with the same level of equipment, machinery, buildings, and so forth.